space for poetry and space for life. It would be fair to say, wouldn't it, Joe, that it's been a presentation that's taken us on a bit of an unexpected journey of our own, just putting this together.
Hasn't it? We have spent months in the making, but it feels like we've only just decided what we're going to talk about.
It's been, you know, we're very keenly aware of how different we feel now as opposed to a month ago, as opposed to a few months ago. So what we've hoped that we would be able to do with this talk is to try and capture a little bit about how we are feeling as people who are working in schools, working with children on their writing, how we're able to capture the way that we're feeling, the way that the children are feeling as part of our talk today. So perhaps to begin with, we might introduce who we are a little bit. So my name is Jonny Walker. I've been a primary school teacher for the last 10 years in the London Borough of Newham in East London. And for the last 5 years of that, I've been working across schools in various ways on oracy projects. So to begin with, it was things like speech making and debating. And more recently, that has included poetry retreats. And over time, I've just ended up specialising a little bit more in the teaching of writing and poetry. So since 2019, I've been working on those projects full time, mostly in Newham schools. And in one of those schools, that's where I met Joe. Joe.
Should I speak for myself, Jonny?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, I'm Jo Castro. Nice to be here. Yeah, I taught for 20 years, although you wouldn't tell, would you? You know, he does look older than me.
Looking fresh.
Yeah, I've taught for 20 years, mainly in the East End, in Newham and Tower Hamlets, with a couple of years working in an international school in Mexico City. I've always had a love of teaching reading and writing. And for 10 of those years, I was an assistant head as well. And then I found myself in, I can't remember what the year it was now, Jonny, but in 2017, I think, I was back in the classroom, in a year 6 classroom, and Jonny and I were sharing a class for a few terms, and we got to talk to each other and realised we had the same passion. And during that time, we decided that we'd really love to work together, and Jonny was setting up something called Otherwise Education. And what really brought us together was a love of books for a start, but also a real feeling that we had great writers in our classroom that didn't know they were great writers, and that we really felt there were still children that were underrepresented and not putting themselves into their own stories and putting themselves in their own writing. And we really wanted to do something about that. So with Otherwise Education, we created writing workshops where we created writing communities. And we particularly asked for children. I think often if you do writing workshops, schools will give you children who are the gifted and talented writers. And we wanted children that had an interest in writing, but we wanted the children that perhaps as well to be identified that maybe there were barriers to that emotionally, behaviourally, or through experience. So we really, in all of our endeavours, we really try to invite the children that might otherwise be overlooked as writers.
Yeah, and I think as the projects have developed, our work across different schools on poetry retreats, poetry residencies and things like that, what we've found is that in almost all of them, we're working with pupils who, by whichever metrics the schools are using, are identified as more vulnerable pupils. So children who've not necessarily had the most advantageous starts in life. What we've found is that the writing process for many of those children is quite a different one, and it's one in which their emotions are perhaps more keenly felt. So whilst the projects are academic in that they are developing writerly habits and the skills of being a writer, our focus has very much always been on the process, and we've adapted quite a lot to the nature of the children that we're working with and to their needs. And we feel that it's given us an interesting perspective. And more than anything, you know, we're not grandstanding in terms of saying within this talk, this is what we have found and this is a perfect way to do things. More than anything, we're wanting to open up a bit of a discussion with each other and with you on the kind of social and pastoral side of an effective writing community, and specifically for poetry. It's been quite bumpy. I don't know if any of you have heard, but there's this thing called COVID, and it's making everyone's lives a little bit hard. And it seems as if everyone's going to be finding it hard anyway. But I think because we have continued working with pupils who are dealing with a lot of stuff as well as COVID, it's meant that the work that we're doing has got a real emotional force to it. And if I'm being candid, and I know you're in the same position, Joe, I'm sure many of you joining in and listening as well will recognize what we're talking about here. You feel the emotional burden a lot more at the moment. And I think in a writing workshop where you are encouraging self-expression and self-understanding and that kind of discussion, it carries its own weight. And it's good that we can perhaps talk about that as a fundamental part of what it is to run these sorts of education spaces. So why are we talking then, as we're going to be doing, about culture and relationships in a poetry writing context? Well, the work that we do with pupils, it mixes the perceptions that we've got and it mixes the experiences that we've got. So Joe works as a coach as well, and Joe's coaching insights feed into a lot of the work that we are doing. And because we're working with more vulnerable pupils who are going through lots of stuff, we never can be, and we never would want to be anyway, solely academic in the way that we're approaching writing. We never lose sight of the fact that there is a social and a pastoral dimension to the work that we're doing with children, which takes precedence over the writing. That doesn't devalue writing, but it fully contextualizes writing within the interactions that it takes place. Now, the research in Ross and Felicity's book, which I'm sure we've all got behind us, mine's fallen down, and I don't want to move and stand up because I'm wearing tracksuit bottoms. I don't want to be shamed by my own outfit. But within their book, their research pointed out in the first chapter about teachers' orientations that the social nature is fundamental to an effective writing community. Children will be pursuing their own interests and their own projects. They'll be referring to like contextualized genre lessons. But at the heart of what makes it effective is that it's an intensely social space, a space of sharing, a space of developing your ideas together, a space in which the teacher is there facilitating talk and demonstrating an interest in children's lives and their writing. Our question that we've been talking about and thinking about a lot is, where does that leave pupils who might not be held back by a desire to write or by a writing skill? Where does that leave pupils who struggle with the social side? Perhaps children who struggle with trust, which is seen as such a fundamental part of an effective writing community. Children who struggle to listen to each other and to build relationships with each other and with their teachers. So we're looking at the idea of writing communities and poetry writing communities in the specific context that we've got here. And we feel it's leading us to some interesting discussions, we hope. Now we're talking about poetry, not just about writing for pleasure, not just a writing community, but a poetry writing community. Why poetry for these pupils, and why poetry, in this context? Well, there's several reasons. Like if we quote Michael Rosen, because obviously he is our deity in terms of the teaching of writing and teaching of poetry with children. Poetry is good for feelings. With poetry, you can talk your way through a feeling, is something that he's said. I'm doing a book with Michael at the moment about teaching poetry with children. So when I'm quoting him at different points, it's in a book which is, I'm told it's coming out in February. So it's currently in press, these quotes. So 2 quotes from Michael which explain why poetry might be specifically important here. Poetry is very good with feelings. You can just talk your way through a feeling in a poem, and you can do that in 100 different ways. Now, another one, and it is a quote that we'll return to a little bit later. When you're owning the language, you feel like you can use it to describe the world. Suddenly, language is full of possibilities. So if you can see poetry as a can-do form, it's something which is accessible. It doesn't mean it's easy, and as Piers Torday was talking about this morning, the kind of metaphorical writing that you do and the dives that you make into expressive writing are not easy, even if the outcome may seem like a very short, simple piece of writing. It's not easy, but we find it's accessible. I mean, Joe, like even in our non-poetry specific writing projects, like the Creative Writing Network's Rites of Passage, poetry is often something we've ended up going to, isn't it?
Yeah, and we feel that because it can be a short form. It liberates the children that see writing as something that is quite intense and laborious, and the struggle is too long for their attention, or for their to maintain attention. So, you know, we're not devaluing poetry and how difficult it can be to write, but it really feels, and we've experienced that those children find a way in much more easily with poetry.
And I think Michael's quote is useful in the way that he says you can do it in hundreds of different ways. And I think Joe and I are the first to acknowledge that our interpretation of poetry and the way in which we use poetry when we're teaching it with children is one particular approach. And I think we do focus on the expressive side of things. We focus on the feelings side, largely because we work with pupils who that has already become, for many of them, a barrier. Would you say, Joe? I don't know.
Yeah, it can be. And I think, I think, as with all things, it depends what's within the child and what comes out for them, because we do lots of anecdotal poetry as well. So yeah, I think it really depends on the day and the situation.
So within that context, then, this is kind of why we're talking about it in the way that we are. We were hoping that you would join us today to look at 3 areas of a effective poetry community. And we think that these are really interesting. They're things which have obsessed us, and we've got plenty of kind of examples and things to talk about within each of these areas. So Joe's going to begin by talking about listening, and it's obviously informed by your teaching, Joe, but your coaching plays a huge part in it as well. I'll go on to share a little bit about space and what the impact is of the different spaces that we have in our writing communities. And then metaphor is a bit weird for us. We're in a weird place, and we hope that you'll be able to join us with this, because it feels clunky and it feels like we've got a lot going on. It feels very important, and I don't know, I feel a little bit lost in metaphor. I know that we're in the right place, and I know that metaphor is very significant for children as young poets, specifically the children we work with, for reasons we'll kind of talk about afterwards. But this feels like something that I don't know how to describe it, Joe. I need a metaphor.
Well, we basically kept talking about, we want to talk about metaphor, but why are we talking about metaphor? But I think we've moved on. So I think we'll wait to the end. And we really hope that actually through listening to us, you can help give us some insights as well. And actually Piers Torday has already given us a bit of help with this one in his talk earlier, hasn't he? So yeah, just join us on an exploration, hopefully, with metaphors.
Yes. So we're going to launch into talking about these 3 different areas. For those of you who are with us as participants here, then, we invite you to contribute. So for one thing, it would be great to hear your views shared in the chat box as well. If you would like to share, obviously there will be certain points at which we pose questions where we will seek your contributions as well. But if you've got something that you feel is really pressing, or a really interesting example, something that's made you think of, do join in and do flag it up to us. My speaker is on quite loud, so if I do look terrified when an unexpected voice appears, I'll get over it very quickly, and I welcome you to contribute. So without further ado, let's get into listening, Joe.
Okay.
Joe, listening. Why did you think that listening was something that would be good for us to talk about within the context of this talk around poetry?
Okay, well, you know I'm obsessed with listening. So could you move on to the next slide for me?
Sure.
Great. As Jonny said, I failed to say in my introduction that I trained as a coach, and I'm now a coach. I coach children and I coach adults in education and outside of education. And I read a book by Nancy Klein in about 2012 called Time to Think. But she's recently got a new book out, The Promise That Changes Everything. So I've become re-obsessed with her. And I just want to read you her quote, because this is why listening is so important. I won't interrupt you. I promise. I won't interrupt your words or your thoughts. Imagine it. Imagine the relief, the possibilities, the dignity.
And why that quote then, Joe? What's the significance of that for a writing community?
Well, I think this comes from being in the classroom as well, but and in life, if you think about, you've probably all got your phones next to you, you've probably got people in another room, you're probably thinking about things that are going on. And actually we're constantly interrupted. And as a society, we think interruption is acceptable. When someone finishes your sentence for you, when someone interrupts your thought or puts a hand up when you're in the middle of talking in order to get their next point. And actually, with the liberation of thinking there is no interruption coming, I'm not going to be interrupted. I'm purely here and someone is interested in me. So it's not just about not being interrupted. You have to have someone else there who is genuinely curious and interested in what you have to say. Then amazing things happen. So if we go on to the next slide, I think what happened when I trained to be a coach is that I suddenly realized that in schools and when we're working with children, we don't give them the opportunity uninterrupted to think, and there should be more of it. So Nancy Klein talks about a thinking environment. So what I've done over the last probably 8 years of teaching was try to create a thinking environment, and how we listen to one another in the class being really important. So there's the 10 components of the thinking environment. And we really need children to have this in order to start thinking. So we need to give attention when someone's talking to us. And that means real attention. It means not sitting there nodding, but thinking about what I'm going to go and get from the shops when I'm finished, or thinking about what the next thing I'm going to say, or thinking about, I'm going to have something really clever to say about what you're saying to me now. How many of us, someone says something really interesting and then we straight away think about what we think about that? Equality, believing that everyone is capable of thinking for themselves. So in the classroom, making sure that we don't assume one child is more capable of thinking than another, and that the children assume that everyone is equal and has something to say. And then with that, we have the ease of feeling that we're going to be listened to. And once we start to realize we are listened to, we can relax into it. And then the competitive nature goes away. I mean, I coach people in the workplace as well. And, it's so often people go into a meeting or at schools in a staff meeting and you're asked a question, and come on, it's often the same person that does the answering that question. It's often the same person that thinks first, that thinks faster than everyone else. And there's that competition already. We've got a competition ahead. Should we get our idea out first? Or I need to show that I know what I'm doing, so I'm going to say something. And when we get rid of all of that and we take all of that away, and those worries about what people will think of us as we're talking, we are able to think more clearly. If we can think clearly, we can write better.
And that's really useful thinking about a classroom setting. I wonder if maybe this might be a good point to put a little question out to people about maybe their own teaching. I know we'll have got some teachers with us here. How can you tell as a teacher when you have a good listening community? And obviously it's a question for you as well, Joe, but I'm curious if other people want to turn on their cameras and microphones and share at this point too. About listening. Any thoughts? I don't know if you can see, Joe. Can you see the chat box? Oh wait, now I can see it.
Yeah.
When the children start to reference each other in their talk. Collective memory. That's interesting, Daisy. There's no pressure if you wouldn't like to go onto camera, but I'm really curious about collective memory.
Hi. I feel like if you have a classroom community where they've learned to listen to each other, they're actually better at remembering stuff that's happened and stuff that you've discussed and talked about. So that, and I've only ever achieved this by having, in a situation where I had one class for a really long period of time. I think I taught some of them for 3 years. And so that meant that they could have the sort of listening community that I wanted, ironically. But I think that's quite powerful. And sometimes if you don't have that, you notice that they just can't even remember what they did, what you talked about last lesson, because they weren't really listening to each other.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I think if I talk about an experience that I've had in a classroom, and what I want to talk about today as well, is that I had a class of children and I had a boy who who was the star of the classroom, and beautiful boy, a lovely boy. There was nothing wrong with that. He was beautiful. He was articulate. He was a really fast thinker, and he dominated that classroom. And he was always the one that spoke. And at the same class, I had a group of 5 girls who had shown great potential in Key Stage 1, and yet their writing was still really lacking. And, you know, from all my research, I was thinking, well, you know, there's a reason here. This boy speaks, and he wasn't the only one, but there were a couple of them, and he just shone out to me, and he spoke all the time, and he was quick. And, you know, we can do the non hands up, but I had to really train them to be listeners. And it's not an easy process, because he actually found it very difficult, because he was suddenly not being heard. So I had to kind of silence him in order to allow other people to speak. And I watched him shrink, and he would look at me with these big puppy eyes as if to say, what are you doing to me? And I, you know, it was a struggle for me, but I was really letting him down by not encouraging him to listen, because his writing wasn't getting any better. There was a real superficial level to his writing. Now, he wasn't a superficial boy because he was never asked for anything more. So his ideas would come quick, they'd come fast, they'd sound good. And, you know, if you think about Piers Torday talking about the drafting process, they were done. He was like, yeah, there you go, I've done it. And yet he wasn't building anything. So by changing the classroom that everyone got equal time to speak, everyone would be listened to the end of their sentence. And I mean it, and it's hard. You do not interrupt. You know, as a teacher, you want to finish that sentence for them, because the whole word pace is in your head. Pace, pace, pace. We've got to have a product. We've got to move on. And actually, once you start to listen and let people finish their sentences, and then ask them nothing else, don't ask a clever question. Don't think, oh, I'm going to show them I know this, but tell me more. You suddenly get a whole different level of thought, and therefore a whole different level of writing. And so whilst this boy found that difficult, by the end of the year, and the girls in the class as well, were able to share their ideas, and you just saw a change in their language. And they were also missing out on the wonderful boy in the corner of the classroom who read so many comics and who had such an entirely different voice in his writing. And then once they started to listen to him, it was infectious. So we talk about children reading, and if they're not widely read, but if they're not widely listening to their peers, they don't need to do all that reading as well. It's there as well. And I'm not saying reading is important, but it's all part of it. And listening is at the heart of it.
Thank you. And there's some more brilliant comments in the comments box as well. Again, there's no pressure if you wouldn't like to share. That's fine. Given that we do the stuff we do, we're like pathologically comfortable with silence to an almost terrifying level. But Sonia, you put that when hands don't just fly up after. I thought that's quite an interesting one in the context of listening. I don't know if you want to join the at least the audio, Sonia, if you were able to. I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, I think. Hi everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of natural teacher instinct to think that hands flying up is what we want to see after we've posed something to children. And I think, as Joe said, and as you said, Jonny, I think it takes space and time to reteach ourselves, I think, and children, that this isn't always the expectation. In fact, we're trying to move away from that expectation. I think, Joe, you summed it up with this allocation of time and appreciation of everyone's thoughts. And if everybody got the same allocation of time, then we've got the space to appreciate what everyone is thinking. Then that creates a space for more to come out from the children, I think, rather than just hands flying up and we just grab the first person who is able to get it up fastest. And it's usually, as you said, that person. We always know when we love that person, but they tend to dominate. Yeah.
Thank you. And to build on that, I think, you know, one of the girls said in response, when I was sort of looking at what had happened, and she said, I never thought anyone would want to hear what I had to say. And that's shocking, isn't it? I never thought anyone would want to hear what I had to say, because they weren't allowed that space. And once she did start to speak, she said, I want to speak more. So, you know, imagine and if you're trying to think of it like as an interruption is an assault on someone's thinking, if you start to think of it like that, it really helps you to just sometimes just go, hang on a minute, wait, stop. I kind of want to talk a bit more about how this works on some of our poetry and the effect it has on the writing as well. So, and how our assumptions. So what we try to do as well, if we've got a thinking environment, is to take away our assumptions of what someone's going to think and say. So we ask often in the poetry, let's think about something you're really interested in, because we don't want to write about something we're not interested in. And so I was sitting with a group of girls, and one of the girls said, oh, I'm really interested in ballet. Now, I love ballet, and I used to do ballet as a child. So instantly I felt, oh, I'm going to connect with this. Oh, great. I love ballet. And I just suddenly thought, oh my gosh. And in my head, I got this beautiful poem about dancing and the movement and the metaphors of the movement. And I thought, stop. And I didn't say anything. Now, I have to be conscious of that as well, because I often in the past have thought, she's going to connect with me and think I'm really listening, because I then tell her about my experience of ballet. She did, so I didn't. And so the conversation went on. And what we got to was the fact that she has afro hair, and one of her ballet exams had been, she'd turned up and she'd literally been told off for her hair because it wasn't correct. And she looked around at her, all the white girls with their hair scraped back neatly and in a perfect bun, and she'd got plaits in her hair, and how that made her feel. And from that, she'd gone somewhere that was way more important to her, and the girls around her were able to connect with that and listen to her and let her finish her story. And then we got their stories of similar things that happened to them. And then we had some writing that was with real passion. Now, I could have stopped that and we could have had a very pretty poem about ballet, and I'd never have heard those experiences from her, and she would never have got them out, and she would never have perhaps written them down. And then actually, when she went on to do more writing for the anthology later, this whole theme became really important to her in her writing. So for me, it's a duty to listen and to wait and to give people time to think.
That's great. Thank you, Jo. And again, thank you all of you, because there's so many brilliant comments in here. Just like in a classroom, I think of it a little bit like the way that we would use a notepad on one of our projects challenges the way we sometimes feel in class. Like, I'm sure they're not in the crowd, but you know, there's sometimes that sense that an attentive child is one who is giving eye contact, and they just absorb every single word. We know as adults in things like this, being distracted is part of listening, and being aware that you're being distracted is part of listening, but also note taking and things like that. And the way that you're kind of processing by chatting in the chat box is really helpful here, I think, too. So let's hold on to these ideas as we move on. So link into listening. Interesting to talk about was space.
So I'm going to ask you some questions here, Jonny.
Okay.
Why did you think space was worth focusing on?
For one thing, when we speak about listening, it feels that there is a culture of listening that develops in a classroom. And it's interesting, you know, you talked about, you know, almost like being assault as an interruption. Mm-hmm. There's certain things which we do by convention within a classroom which are very easy to justify, and they're extremely well intentioned, but within the space of a classroom, there's a certain set of expectations of pace and how fast we do things, the way in which questions happen, the idea that we've got a predetermined place we want to get to by a certain point in the lesson, so we bring people with us. What I've found doing the poetry retreats especially is that the change of space changes a lot more, and it's a lot different to how I guess imagined it would be. Like when we do poetry retreats, just to give the context, we've run poetry retreats, myself and Adissa. I know some of you were in his workshop in the morning, so he and I run poetry retreats together and have done since 2016 with year 5 and 6 pupils from East London. And the idea for that project initially comes from, it was coming from a place of, we're all based in East London. We would like for children to have the opportunities to see nature. And we felt that by taking the children down to the New Forest, it would fuel their imaginations because they would see these big trees. We could go on big walks and see the forests. Having Adissa there as well was a big part of it because he's such an ambassador for nature. He's always like sprinting off through the fields, and we just felt that if we get everybody out there, we'll be able to create some really good nature poetry, was the initial way we thought of it. What we found right from the very first year, and I would say increasingly since, the more that we've attuned ourselves to it, is whilst the nature is important, the bigger change for the pupils is having the space away from their everyday realities. Given the choice of writing authentically about things that were on their mind, where we might have shared different poems with them but encouraged them to write about their interests and their thoughts, the children were writing about home. The children were writing about their families. They were writing about sibling rivalries and their favourite foods. Given that we had children from different schools all together, there was often a kind of exchange between pupils that was not possible in the classroom. And it was much more like you were talking about, Joe, that a real listening community where the children are learning from each other. There was something about the dynamic of being on a retreat where we are not in a classroom that allowed the adults who were there, as well as the children, to step out of the kind of schoolish space and all of those conventions that go along with it. There's a feeling of rushedness. I'm sure we all know that horrible feeling of, you know you've got a certain amount of stuff to do, and then as you're looking at the clock, it looks like one of those Salvador Dali clocks, and it's starting to melt, and it's spinning, and it's spinning, and it's spinning. It's as if the nature of being in a classroom is to be so acutely timed, and that goes against what we know about an effective writing community, for one thing. It goes against the way that Piers was talking this morning about how long the process is for him to have come up with all of his ideas, for example, about hares. It wasn't like, come on, Piers, we need your next book out, and then he just goes and does it as a first draft. Ideas take longer, and what we found with the children is that by being out in nature, by being out in a different space, it changed a lot. It changed a lot about the way that they think.
That was kind of my next question about what did you notice with the writing? And I guess you kind of talked about that there, about that they didn't naturally write about nature because they were in nature. But, you know, did you notice anything different that came out?
I think what we noticed was that children were much happier to spend time generating ideas. I know I've spoken with Ross and Felicity about this, and they put a huge investment within their approach in idea generation. I think sometimes we presume that children have got lots and lots and lots that is ready to be said, which is different to saying they've got lots to say. I think all children have got lots to say. But just saying, now tell me it, doesn't really work. That's not how our brains work. It's not how their brains work. What we were kind of able to do on something like a poetry retreat or some of our other projects is to spend a lot longer toying with ideas, for children to know that they can scrap an idea and go their own route with it. We might have shared one poem and suggested, this is an interesting way that the poet's done it, isn't it? Maybe we could have a look at doing this if we wanted to as well. And they have to know that we mean it when we say that, not that we're trying to trick them, into thinking that we're giving them an option when we're not. An example would be that on the poetry retreats, on one of the days, the first thing we did in the morning, Adissa gets us all up to do exercises. He's already been up for 2 hours doing exercises already, and I'm mostly just in my pajamas, just blanketing myself. But his day begins with a run, and then we get the children up exercising. And he might share one small poem with them before we even have our breakfast. Then one group of children might be talking about that. They might be sitting with him over breakfast, and he might mention it again. And then those children chat about it a little bit more. It might be that then as we are walking, we might be climbing a hill in the morning, we're doing it to go to a particular place to get a particular view, but the journey and the conversations that were happening as we were walking that's our lesson. The lesson is the walking, the lesson is the talking. That's what I like most about teaching, is the conclusion that I've got to. And I know it's very typical given that my surname is Walker. I've kind of typecast myself, but really that's all I like to do, is just to walk and talk. And some of the nicest conversations, some of the things which make you so proud to be a teacher, and some of the things which just enrich you, where you realise the difference that you're making, and you realise the power that we've got as a teacher. It doesn't necessarily come about just because you're stood in front of a PowerPoint. It comes about just in your everyday talk, when you've got that space where there is real listening, and when children are able to talk about things which matter to them as well.
I really love that about that space there, Jonny, as well, about the walking beside someone when it's not looking directly at someone and you're doing a venture together. So actually the movement, the not making eye contact, because we tend to think of listening has to be eye contact, but actually when we're in thought, we're not really, the person that's doing the talking isn't looking at the listener. When you're truly in thought, you're looking elsewhere, you're looking up, you're looking to the side, you're thinking. So actually the being beside someone and listening can be really, really powerful, can't it? And I think, and also the fact that you're moving as well can all impact on the quality of the thought.
Well, it changes. It's kind of the opposite of some of the dynamics we may have in a classroom. And it's not that we individually create those dynamics, but it's in the engineering of a school. It's in the way that the chairs and tables are arranged. It leads to a certain kind of pressure on an interaction, where to speak up in a class feels like you're pulling the attention onto yourself. It changes the way. I mean, the example that I've got on the screen at the moment, which I'll play for you, is an interesting one. So this is a year 3 student from one of the schools that I've been working with this term. So in their case, it's a poetry residency, and they happen to have got a bit of woodland at the back of their school grounds. This student is a kid who loves stories and storytelling. And in some ways, he's quite similar, Joe, to the child that you mentioned earlier on, who in a group discussion, he would probably be the first with his hand up, the first to contribute. And the quality of what he would say would be enough that it might inhibit other children from wanting to share, because they'll think, well, my idea's not ready, like his is ready. There's a sense that sometimes that is a good thing. It's like, oh, good, at least someone's with me. Someone responded, someone acknowledged I'm here. What was interesting in this is we were looking at the Jabberwocky, and they were all taking funny interpretations of it. And he was someone who ordinarily would have just been the first to have finished and said, I've done it, guys, can we listen? Like, everyone, if you stop writing, I want to share. I love this video because you can see that by being out in nature and seeing, even just by looking at his eyes, the thought process is there, and you can see how he is kind of evaluating his word choices in the poem that he's creating. So it's like a live video of him toying with his ideas. The sort of thing that you can have maybe in this sort of space. So I'm going to play. Hopefully you hear the sound as well. I think you will.
So it said it was very creepy and tight, cold and gloomy. So it was like almost black, but then there was like, it was covering, there was no sky. And then it said, the trees twist and turn like creepers, so grow giants, and shoot sticks like arrows. The trees twist like creepers, and then they shoot that sticks from the tree that are sticking out towards anyone that's coming there. And then it's just like, beware the trouble bang and the cheese stir.
Maybe in the way that we opened up a little bit within your talk, Joe, about listening, it might be useful to put that out to chat and to anyone who wants to contribute at this point. How did this look different? Because not all children, I'd be lying if I said all children approached it in that same way, but what did it make anyone think of about maybe their own writing classrooms, what kind of thought happens in our writing classrooms? Was it similar to this? Was it different? And in what way? Does that work?
Sounds good. I'd like to hear from people.
Yeah. Because I think elements of it do function in the classroom too. It's a social space as much as a physical one. He didn't need there to be a tree above him to imagine the tree, although maybe it helped. Okay, I'm looking in the chat box.
Yeah, I like that, the spontaneous talk. Yeah.
Mm.
He was very spontaneous there, wasn't he? And you could just see him thinking further. And I loved him laughing at what he'd said. That real pleasure in what he'd come up with there was really, really interesting.
It was a rare 45 seconds when I wasn't dominating or speaking. It's interesting what happens when you do, isn't it? Hmm. Maybe an interesting question here is how much of that is necessarily tied to being outdoors, or was it at all tied to being outdoors? Could you develop that same space where children can process that thought when they are in a crowded classroom? I'm curious of that. That's very interesting, Justine. Interesting that we're bringing metaphors in there, Joe.
Isn't it? Thank goodness.
Jason's a mind reader here. Yes.
Yeah.
So, like, when we're talking about all of this, then, you know, I think the reason we're mentioning listening and the reason that we are mentioning space is because, you know, to bring it back to the pupils that we typically are working with, they're children who perhaps have not necessarily had either of those in much abundance. They might not necessarily be in the habit of being listened to, so they might find the silence of an active listener quite challenging. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Joe.
Yeah, it can be very daunting, and you're right. When you are, that's why a lot of children will reveal things to you when you're busy doing something else. My son always tells me something important when I'm driving a car because he knows I can't react. But it is that thing of actually it's a safe time to open up when you're not staring at me directly.
Yeah, and with space as well. Again, it's not that we're saying you all need to like knock your classrooms down and rewild a forest so that you can teach a poem in it. There's something interesting about looking objectively at the kind of learning culture that pops up in a classroom purely through the habits of having hands up. I mean, I don't know, my thinking on this is still a bit cloudy, so do feel free to shoot it down. But with turn taking seems very democratic. But one of the negative elements, I suppose, of turn taking is that if you are looking around and thinking, okay, I'll choose you, and then I'll choose you, and then I'll choose you, you're trying to include as many people as possible, but what we're including is often quite a superficial response, and the children don't then have the opportunity to reflect on what other people have said when giving their response. And a little bit like the example you gave of the pupil earlier, Joe, as well, it means that child, when it comes to writing, is not able to embed other children's ideas within their own, or certainly engage with those ideas before jotting down their own thoughts. Okay, well, it was interesting that a couple of you mentioned metaphor, because we want to secure your help with this. I'm so sorry. You're going to hear about the Chester again there. We wanted to talk about metaphor. As we say, it's something that we've been speaking about a lot, and it feels as if the children we've been working with who have been at the front of our minds through the times that we are in at the moment on the projects that we're working with, metaphor seems very, very significant to them in the way that they interact with us, and especially when it comes to getting things down on the page. Our thinking is still in a state of flux, I would say here, isn't it, Jo?
Well, I think we had a long conversation about the importance, but we both felt it was hugely important to talk about, and we couldn't quite, we hadn't thought it through enough. But actually, the more we've talked about it, surprisingly, the more our thoughts have developed on this. And in fact, we had such a long discussion yesterday. I think I started dreaming about it last night. But I think for us, the importance of metaphor is it creates a safe space to talk and express emotion. And a metaphor cannot be, a child's not necessarily deliberately using it to mask something that they want to tell you. They might even subconsciously be telling you something through the metaphors. So it's a double-edged sword. It's like the more we use metaphor, the more we understand them and then can therefore use them. So then the more we're exposed to them, the more useful they come to us. And I think my real interest in it is because as a coach, again, there's a real drive to use something called clean language by someone called David Grove. And when someone is talking and they're really investing their emotion, they'll often use a metaphor. So if they're stuck with a problem, it's like, oh, I feel like I'm walking in quicksand. And if they use that metaphor with clean language approach to coaching, we would then go with the metaphor. So we would just explore it further with open questions like, oh, what does that sand feel like? What would it feel like if your feet weren't in that sand? So because the brain's chosen that metaphor, it's somewhere that they're visually inhabiting this space for themselves. So by not breaking the metaphor when we interact with them and our questioning being linked to the metaphor, we then are able to draw more out of them. So I really think it's something that poetry allows us to do. So we were talking about this, is this how to write poetry or why we write poetry? And I think for us, writing is so much linked to good mental health and expression and people finding a voice, that the use of metaphor, see, I'm losing myself in my metaphors. It's so important as a way to draw out the emotion. So if someone's talking to me, so for example, I think about a coaching session where someone was very stressed at work and they were saying, it's like bombs are falling. It's like thing she said was a war metaphor. And so, but I knew that this person also created for her team, she kind of defended them against the attacks. And so I said to her, well, how do you create such a great team then? And she started to describe an orchestra. And so I was able to say, wow, so who plays what in your orchestra? And so therefore, we moved from the rhetoric of war to her metaphor of the orchestra. And suddenly she shifted and she was able to think differently and her mood changed. And by really going into detail of the orchestra and how it worked, it completely changed. And again, I might be talking in circles, so forgive me, but that also linked to some research I did, in that actually there was a research study, and I haven't put on a slide, I'm afraid, I can find it out, but of people who had depression, and they got the people with depression to write down every day how they were feeling. One group had to write it like, I felt anxious, confused, just literally, and the other group had to describe how they were feeling in metaphors. And it was reported at the end of this time that the people who wrote in metaphors actually felt much better and were able to change their mood and to come out of the depressive feelings. So metaphors are just brilliant, aren't they? They're just so good for us. And they're so lovely to play with. And I think of literature, I think of, reading Cloud Busting by Mallory Blackman. And my son and I now use the term fizzy feet for when he is feeling distressed. And he actually uses fizzy brain, but he chose that metaphor. He went with it. It resonated with him, and now he uses it. I just think they're exciting. but I think they're so valuable as well, and they're really a way of connecting with someone. So I think my point is, don't ignore the metaphor and allow a child to go with it.
And it's interesting, I wonder whether there is a distinction between the way that children as writers do this and adults as writers. I know one of the things we were talking about, Joe, was that some children might use metaphor because the literal is too much to take. And there will be some children who can articulate purely literally, I feel anxious because when you spend your time with this person, it makes me feel like I might be abandoned. They can articulate at the literal level things which show a real raw emotion. Perhaps the children that we end up working with, they rely on metaphor because metaphor, at least, like you suggested, puts that little bit of distance between the literal reality of where things are for them. It's interesting, and poetry allows that to happen. Again, from the Michael Rosen book, which is forthcoming, it ends with an interview, and we did the interview shortly after Michael had been kind of convalescing, really, and he was coming back to health, and he'd been thinking about writing and recuperation. And we were talking about why bother. Like, that was the question we were looking at, and it works quite well as a question here. Why bother with writing? Why bother getting children to write poetry? And Michael used the metaphor to talk about that himself. He had this idea that like a thought which is in your head, which you want to express, but you've not got the tools to say it just yet, is like an abscess in your tooth. I'm going to quote him verbatim here. So he said, if things happen to you in your life and they are bothersome or even traumatic, anything along the way from itchy to terrible, then what do you do with it? If you have no outlet at all to express it, then what does it do? It sits in your head. Like I say, he turned it into an abscess. He said it eats away in your mind. If you write about it, in my experience, two things happen. You put it into an order and a shape, which is satisfying in itself, but also, now that it's out and it's on the page, you've got something that you can contemplate. Now, hearing him talk about that, I think immediately of pupils that we've worked with and things that they have written, where the objectivity that they get about their own emotional state seems, and it is interpretation from my part, it seems to have only come once they've written it down. It's not so much they had this idea in their head and they wanted to get it onto the page. Like Michael suggests, it's just there's something in there that needs to get out, and creating the space to write it and the kind of listening culture which enables someone to feel confident enough to do so enables the child to write in that way. It enables them to share their feelings. But I don't think it's easy in a classroom. I don't think it's easy necessarily as a teacher. I mean, if we shimmy along a little bit, Joe, you'd mentioned before about if you follow somebody's metaphor, you follow their thinking. Perhaps I share an anecdote from the poetry retreats. So there was a pupil. The way we end each poetry retreat is with a fire ritual, which is not as dangerous as it sounds. We've spent 3 days by this point wandering around like we're doing here in the New Forest, talking, writing all day. We wake up, we exercise, and we have 2 hours of chatting and writing. Then we go and explore. We come back, have showers, get warm, write, talk. It's just a really, really rich community of that talk. And it's very meaningful for the children and for the adults. Brilliant, okay. So there was one pupil who took part in this, and we'd had lots of talks. He wasn't necessarily connecting lots and lots of the children, but he had a few good conversations with a few other children. He had a few good conversations with me. And it was very clear, and we can all kind of read the subtext of this. It was clear that he was dealing with a lot, and you can sense it. On the way that we end our final day of the retreat is we're all gathered around this fireplace, and we talk about how poetry is not just about the poem, it's about the poetic life. It's about having the opportunity to create something. So it's the process, not just the product. And to prove the point, we talk about you don't need to create something which lasts. We're going to create something now which is meaningful to us, and then it will be gone forever. We're going to write something that no one will ever read. And all the children write something. And obviously we hold ourselves to it. I don't know what they wrote. We never have done. But on this one evening, this child, his whole body changed. It was the first time I'd seen him really, really committed to whatever it was that he was writing. Whatever it was extremely significant to him. Now, we're very mindful of listening, and we're very mindful of space in the way we've been talking about it. It wouldn't have felt right to have done that and watched them. The children place them on a poker, and I put them into the fire, and they watch whatever it is they've written burn. Some of them did that, and they were ready to go. They thought it was interesting. They thought it was thought-provoking, but it didn't go much deeper than that. For him, he sat and he watched, and he wanted to see every single scrap of that paper burn before he moved. I said we could stay as long as they wanted, and he sat with Adissa and I for 40 minutes watching the fire with one of the other pupils. And then he left, and we didn't talk about it. On the coach home the next day, he shared a poem with me, which I've got here. I'll read it to you. So it was called Little Bird. Little bird in the sky, flying by, flying high. Little bird in the sky, catching worms, digging by. Little bird in the sky, coming home for dinner time. Little bird in the sky, admired the fire, dancing close by. So he shared it with me as we were sitting on the back of the coach. And I was moved by it immediately, and I was moved that he chose to share it. But in a kind of teacherly enthusiasm, I was immediately wanting to know more. And I was starting off by saying, oh, the fire, that's interesting. Admired the fire. That reminds me of yesterday. I'm still going with it. I'm not undermining his metaphor at that point. And he was like, oh, yeah, no. He's made the link too. But then I'd said, oh, so are you the little bird then? Are you like the little bird who admired the fire? And in that moment, it was out of a curiosity, and it was out of a nice engagement I was having with him talking about his words. But I feel like in that moment, I did exactly what you had mentioned, Joe, as not the right thing to do. He's presented a metaphor, and he presented a metaphor out of choice. And I've tried to, get my little glasses on and be like, I think I know what you're doing here. We have a tendency, or certainly I did in that moment, to want to decode in order to help. And sometimes, if we're thinking about children as authentic writers, there is an enigma to what children choose to write. And sometimes that's intentional. So metaphor leaves you in this interesting, an interesting limbo. Or I guess all I'm saying here is it can be challenging, because to be well-intentioned but not to be fully mindful of a child's motivations to write means that you can sometimes respond in a way which is not the most beneficial. Was that an overshare?
I think that's really interesting, and I think we have to be careful, don't we, not to just jump onto that. Oh, we've worked it out, which we turn, and we all have a response to something when we've read a poem. We all want to think, we've worked it out our way, our comprehension, our understanding of it. But yeah, maybe he hadn't seen that link himself, or didn't, wasn't ready to see it, or it wasn't there. So yeah, I guess it's just being cautious about putting our interpretations on things. But I'm sure it was fine, Jonny.
Well, I hope so. It just stuck in my mind, a bit like the abscess. I needed to talk about it, like Michael said. I needed to get it out so I can analyse it, because it's, that was a good time ago now, and you find, don't you, as a teacher, when you've had that experience, there's certain conversations that stick with you just as much as you hope they would stick with the students. You go back to.
We're nearly out of time, Jonny.
I think we are. I think we've hit time, haven't we? So perhaps we can end on this. So we have spoken then about just our own, I guess, anecdotal thoughts on listening and space and metaphor. I don't feel like we can end on a sort of grandstanding point, because I don't feel that we've not been advancing a particular approach or argument. But I do like with this quote that it ends very optimistically by providing children with attentive listening where they can develop their thoughts, by providing them with a space where they can truly think, maybe step out of their everyday reality, and by not trampling over their personal interpretation, the way they choose to express what they want to say. We're empowering them. We're making sure that they see that language as the language that they choose, the language that belongs to them, and that is in itself, optimistic, full of possibilities. Joe, please take the final word from me, because I feel like everything I've just said about being comfortable with silence is withering out of my body.
I thought that was a lovely way to end. I don't think there's anything to add. I thought that was lovely, and I think it is. It's about, I think we're motivated by giving children their voice, and expressing it is full of possibilities. I think you said it beautifully. I don't think you needed me to add anything. Shall we say goodbye, Jonny?
Shall we say goodbye? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We would love to hear more from you as well. So if you did think about these things and want to talk more, you can find both of us on the Twitters. And now we can all go and savour David Armand.
Yay!
Yay!
I'm excited.
Big fans. Okay, thank you.